After we got all the old parts off the engine that we need to swap over to the new engine, we spent a lot of time cleaning things up because there was a lot of grit and grease and dirt on those parts, and we didn't want to put some dirty parts onto this engine. Also, we cleaned up surfaces like for the exhaust manifolds. We had to clean up the connection for the exhaust crossover pipe to the tailpipe. We cleaned up the intake manifold. We cleaned up a lot of stuff, and it just took a lot of time. A lot of brake cleaner, a lot of rags, a lot of brushing, a lot of wire wheeling. So depending on the dirtiness of your engine, you might be spending quite a bit of time cleaning up parts, like myself and Sean and Ray and Joe did. A lot of work. Now we're ready to start putting the parts on the engine. Some of the things we're going to do are optional, but Ray decided to renew a lot of the parts because the engine's going to be torn down and it was the right time to do it. One of those things is the NOx sensors. The NOx sensors sit in this valley right underneath the intake manifold. So he took the suggestion of Yoda One Performance to replace those NOx sensors and to also replace the wiring harness for those NOx sensors. So we're going to show you how to do that right now. The fitting size of these NOx sensors is a 27 millimeter. If you wanted to torque these to spec, I think your best bet is getting a 27 millimeter crow's foot. Because this has the electrical connector on the top, I don't think a standard socket will work. So you have to have a deep socket. And then when you look at how much room you have in here, I don't believe you're going to have enough room to get the ratchet in there. I don't have a 27 millimeter crow's foot or a deep 27 millimeter socket to try it, so we're just going to use our torque elbow and use a big 27 millimeter box end wrench to cinch these up. They screw in at opposing sides. I'm going to use this big box end wrench, and this thing has a lot of leverage. The torque value for these NOx sensors is 29 foot-pounds. So I'm going to do my best guess with my torque elbow and cinch them up. And that's good. And that's good. Here's the old wiring harness that we're going to replace. So we're going to pay attention to where this bend was, because this little crook right here went right behind this piece right here, right in between the timing cover, behind the cam pulleys. So we want to tuck that behind there. And then we got to get these connected. We've got the NOx sensor harness connected to the NOx sensors. The next thing we're going to get installed is the engine coolant bypass pipe. It's this sucker right here. This hose hanging onto here is one of the ones that goes under the throttle body. We just decided to keep it connected. This connection right here drops into here, and there's no gasket that Toyota sells for this. So what we're going to use, and what was suggested to us, is use some FIPG. We're going to use the black 103 FIPG for this application. This has a little indentation around the circle here. I'm going to fill that with a bead of the FIPG. This stuff right here, the 103. Another thing that the kit from Yoda One Performance comes with, it comes with this foam gasket material. You can use some of it on this, basically as an extra barrier to keep gunk from getting in this valley between the heads. And it also works for putting it on the backside of the upper timing cover to help seal it and keep debris out of that area around the timing belt and pulleys. So I'm going to carefully get this in here and not mess up the FIPG. The first thing you have to get aligned is this bracket hole lined up with the stud on the back of the engine. So you come in, you get that over the stud, and then you rotate this down, and you want to line it up and ideally not smear the FIPG. You want to get the holes aligned and be ready to go with your bolt. Okay, give it to me. Scalpel. What we did, so you don't drop the bolt, is we put a little black tape over the head of the socket, force the bolt into there, and then when you turn it upside down, it won't drop out as you're getting these two 10 millimeter bolts started. This is an old trick that I use a lot. The torque spec for these 10mm bolts is 75 inch-pounds. I'm going to bring them up slowly and equally. It's a light torque spec. That's it, man. I'm going to get the 10mm nut in place over the stud. We're going to go ahead and use the same torque spec for this one. We didn't look it up, but we assume it's pretty close to 75 inch-pounds. There it is, 75 inch-pounds. This harness comes supplied with a clip, and the clip plugs right into the water pipe right here. Just like so. One thing that we just noticed on the reassembly is that we found out we have to harvest these 4 studs in the corners for the intake manifold installation. The new engine doesn't come with these studs, so we're going to use a double nut technique to back these studs out of the heads. The way you use the double nut technique is you get 2 of the intake manifold nuts and you screw them onto one of the studs. Then you take 2 open-end wrenches and tighten the 2 nuts together really firm. Then, while holding tension, keeping the nuts firmly attached together, you try to turn the whole assembly lefty-loosey, and hopefully you're going to see that the stud starts backing out of the head. If the nuts start turning on the stud and the stud isn't moving, that means you need to get the nuts a little bit tighter. Yep, it's working. A whole thing spinning. Woohoo! There's one. Okay, you get the idea. We're going to do the same thing with all of them. We got all the studs bottomed out by hand. We're going to use the same double nut technique to cinch up the studs into the heads. No torque value, just cinch them up to where they bottom out. It feels pretty tight. Call it good. All right, we got the 4 studs in the corners. We got the intake manifold gaskets in place on top of the heads. We're going to drop the intake manifold on the motor. Just like that. We're going to install our bolts, and remember, we kept track of where they went, front of the engine. So I'm just going to pull this one out and put it in the front left. Take the next one out. And you get the idea. I'm going to get all these started. For the 4 corners, you're going to want to first put a washer and then the nut. That also has kind of like a flange to it. We're going to get the other 3 installed. The torque value for the 8 intake manifold bolts and the 4 intake manifold nuts is 13 foot-pounds or 156 inch-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and use my inch-pound torque wrench, and I'm going to tighten this just like you would tighten anything with multiple fasteners. I'm going to start in the corners, bringing it up slowly to spec. So corner, 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 and then a little bit more inside, boom, 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 and then all the way to the center, and then keep on doing that pattern, slowly bringing it up to the spec. Okay, I did 1 pass, a couple turns each. Now I'm going to do the same thing again. A couple turns. You get the idea. I'm just going to keep on going with this. I did several passes, probably like 4 or 5 passes before I was able to get it up to the torque value. A couple turns at each one, crisscrossing pattern, and that's what I suggest you do. Don't get crazy and impatient, tightening them down too much too soon. Do it slowly and evenly. I'm next going to get the intake manifold stay in place. The lip faces upward, not downward, and it goes on in this fashion. The torque value for these bolts is the same as the intake manifold, 13 foot-pounds or 156 inch-pounds. Okay, they're both torqued to spec. We're now going to install the water outlet pipe. The Yoda 1 kit comes with a new gasket for it. Ray decided to get a new outlet pipe. This is optional. Put the gasket down, it only could go on one way, and then put the water neck on, or outlet pipe. It's held on by 3 small nuts. One thing to note while you're doing this is you got to be really careful not to drop anything in the engine. I think I'm going to tape this up just like when we do a valve cover gasket job when we're getting the fuel rails in place, just so I don't make a stupid mistake and drop something into the engine. We looked for a torque spec for this water outlet in the factory service manual. We searched for a while, got tired of searching. Since they're a very small fastener, a 10mm nut, I'm going to go from experience of what I've seen in the factory service manual for this size nut, and I'm going to go with 75 inch-pounds and then just see how that feels. I might give it an extra turn with a little short ratchet with very little mechanical advantage. That hit, that hit, that hit. When it transitions to my little shorty ratchet, very little mechanical advantage, I'm just going to check and see what it feels like. That's pretty tight. Maybe just a tiny turn, like a 32nd of a turn, 64th of a turn. It's good to go. Next, I'm going to prepare to get the fuel rails back onto the intake manifold. I first have to put the 4 spacers in place, 2 on each side. We're next going to get the injectors connected to the fuel rails. The Yoda 1 Performance Kit comes with a gasket kit, so you can renew all the gaskets on your old injectors if you are going to use the old injectors. So the kit comes with the upper O-ring that goes into the fuel rail, the bottom O-ring that goes into the intake manifold, and the cushion ring. What Ray decided to do, which is a good decision, is he got some refurbished injectors from Motor West Performance in Southern California. We highly recommend for this job that you go ahead and get some nice injectors to mate up with your new engine. Your new engine is going to run better with injectors that are all matched for their injection amount, and there's no blockages, and they're going to run just much better. So Ray made the right decision. So what the factory service manual suggests to do is you lubricate the O-rings with a little bit of gasoline. I just got a little bowl. I'm going to dip it into the gasoline, and then I'm going to install it on the fuel rail. And I'm just going to push it in and give it a little twist, and I'm going to do the same for the rest of them. Here's the 2 fuel rails with 6 injectors installed. You can easily tell the difference between the 2 sides because the driver's side, this one right here, has the fuel pressure regulator connection on the back side of the motor. And then for the orientation for the passenger side, you know that these connections right here have to go over the spacers towards the middle. I'm now going to dip the O-rings into the fuel and then push them into the intake manifold. And you want to do this sort of gently. You want to get them down in there and slowly work them and rock them in place. Once you think you got it seated, give each injector a little twist to make sure they're not binding up, that you maybe got the O-ring folded over and out of place. That feels good. I'm going to do the same with the other side. Next, I'm going to install the fuel rail bolts that secure the fuel rails to the intake manifold. They're 12mm bolts. The torque spec for these bolts is 120 inch-pounds or 10 foot-pounds. Okay, those are good. Okay, all 4 bolts are torqued to 120 inch-pounds. Next, I'm going to install this fuel rail pipe that joins the fuel rails on the front of the motor. The Yoda 1 kit comes with the necessary washers for this. So you want to put a washer in between the fitting and the fuel rail, and you want to put a washer between the head of the bolt and the fitting. So 1 washer on either side of this fitting. If you forget one, you're going to have a leak. So I'm going to put 1 on the bolt, slide it into the fitting, and then put another one on. You technically can't mess this up, but to save yourself some time, the little bend faces the front. If you turned it this way, it would get in the way of the plenum coming down. So you only can get this on one way. I have a washer on both sides of the fitting. I'm gonna line it up with the fuel rails and get them started. The torque value for these banjo bolts is 25 foot-pounds. What we learned in the past when we did an ejector swap for our buddy Greg is that you can't get a socket and a torque wrench in here, so I'm gonna have to employ a crow's foot to get these to the proper spec. When you're gonna use a crow's foot, in order to get the proper torque spec, you have to have the crow's foot at a right angle to your wrench. If you had it like this, now you're increasing the leverage and you're gonna change the torque value. And if you had it at a shallower angle, you're gonna change it also. So you need to try to keep the orientation at a right angle. So you have to keep on resetting it as you tighten them up. I'm first gonna cinch them up with a box end wrench, and then I'm gonna finish it with the torque wrench. Okay, I took all the slack out. Now I'm going to go to the torque wrench. There it is, 25 foot-pounds. There it is, 25 foot-pounds. Now we're going to get the rear connection on the passenger side. It leads to the fuel inlet connection that we unscrewed on the driver's side right near the fender. Same thing, banjo bolt, 2 washers on either side of the fitting. Rotate it in place. And you don't need to see us work a torque wrench again. Same torque value for this one, 25 foot-pounds. We did a little bit of anatomy and physiology of this engine while we were disconnecting all the parts off the old engine. I don't think I mentioned this hose that hooks up to the IAC. It leads to a T that goes to either side of the intake manifold. And what this is called is an air assist hose. This goes to a couple ports and it feeds air to the fuel injectors. So that's what that is for. This is one of the coolant hoses that attaches underneath the throttle body. So that's what this one is, that attaches to a nipple on the back side of the intake manifold. This one right here that connects up to the coolant bypass pipe, this is the other coolant hose that attaches to the IAC. So they attach just like this under the throttle body. This sensor right here with the single prong connector, this is your coolant temperature sensor that sends information to the gauge on your dashboard to let you know the temperature of your engine. These are things you normally easily can't see because the plenums are in the way. The next thing we're going to get in place is the fuel pressure regulator right here. We already have the hoses attached. This line is the return hose, and this is a vacuum hose that goes up to the plenum. It plugs into the back of the driver's side fuel rail. It does have a O-ring that you want to lubricate with a little fuel, and then just plug it in. Then we got to get the bolts in place. A couple 10mm bolts. The torque spec for this fuel pressure regulator connection is 71 inch-pounds. The next thing I'm going to do is install the spark plugs. Not every spark plug socket is created equal. I'm going to use a magnetic one. They have those rubber grommet ones, not as good as the magnetic ones. These will never wear out. This is a flex head one from Gear Wrench. You can get it in when you don't have a straight shot to the spark plug tube. These spark plugs come pre-gapped, so as long as the box wasn't mangled, your spark plug gap should be okay. Insert it into your spark plug socket and it's tightening away. Okay, you get the idea. I'm gonna get all of them installed. The torque value for the spark plugs is 13 foot-pounds or 156 inch-pounds. I'm using my inch-pound torque wrench. And there it is, 156 inch-pounds. I'm gonna do the same with the other 5 cylinders. next thing we're getting in place is the whole wiring harness. It was a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle, but we finally got it set onto the top of the motor. This big part right here goes to the back, right behind the fuel rails. You'll notice that there's a bracket that this will slide onto. This one's a little bit beat up and broken, so it's no longer going to work. You might have found that a previous owner did a valve cover gasket job, maybe a mechanic shop did it, and the plastic wiring loom that feeds the fuel injectors is all broken to pieces. So if you found that on your engine, or you broke it as you were doing this job, use some split wire loom that you can get at any auto parts store. This is a 3/4 inch size wire conduit, and that's what we did on this passenger side to protect the wires, because most of the plastic harness was broken up. The only piece that is left is right here near the front of the motor. So now we're going to start getting some of the things connected. So we're going to get the fuel injectors connected. Okay, all 6 fuel injectors are connected. This connector right here goes to the coolant temperature sensor for your gauge. Slide that over the post. This is a common one that people mess up when they're doing the valve cover gasket job. They pull up on this wiring harness and they inadvertently pull this off the post, and then they wonder, how did I mess up my coolant temperature gauge? Well, this slid off. So it's kind of hard. You could actually get in there and put this back on with the engine in the engine compartment, but better not to forget it right now. So we got that connected. Looking at everything, these are 2 plugs. One goes to the IAC, one goes to the throttle position sensor. We've got these 3 on the side that are going to go to the coil packs that we're going to install really soon. This part of the harness goes over to the igniter. This is to the mass airflow sensor. This part goes through the firewall to the ECU. This one goes to the coolant temperature sensor that communicates with the ECU. We got the NOx sensor that connects here. We got these 2 that drop down on the passenger side. One goes to the crank position sensor. This one goes to the AC unit. These 2 right here, one goes to the alternator. Another one goes to the crank position sensor. This whole harness, the long piece here, looks like spaghetti, goes back towards the transmission. These connectors over here go over to the driver's side to the Evap, the vapor pressure sensor. So that's a quick down and dirty of the anatomy of the wiring harness. Since I'm here, I'm going to connect up the coolant temperature sensor, and I'm going to connect up the NOx sensors. Next, I'm going to install the coil packs. Here's another option. You could get new coil packs, or you could reuse your old ones. Ray decided to get new coil packs. Slide them on down. And then you gotta get your 10mm bolt started. Alright, they're all started. The torque spec for these 10mm coil pack bolts is 69 inch-pounds. Okay, they're all torqued to 69 inch-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and connect the electrical connectors. Alright, they're all good. Since we're right here on this side, I'm going to install the new PCV valve that Ray bought. Yoda One provides the grommet in the passenger side valve cover. You just push down and get that sucker in there. I lubricated it with a little bit of motor oil. Now the insertion will be a lot easier. A little lubrication goes a long way. Next, what we're going to install are the studs for the exhaust manifolds on both sides. Ray bought these through Yoda One. It's optional. You can salvage your old ones, but why do that? Make it easier for yourself so you don't have to spend time fighting, maybe getting them out of the head. Just get the new ones. They come with a red sealant on the end of the threads. The head is a E8 Torx. And I'm just going to spin these into both sides. No torque value for these. I'm just going to cinch them up snug with this little 1/4 inch ratchet and call it good. it bottoms out, cinch it up, and call it good. I'm going to do the same with this side and the 6 on the other side. We have all the exhaust manifold studs in the heads. Now we're going to get the gasket in place. It's a 3-layer metal gasket. Slide that on. It'll kind of hang out there. And then get your exhaust manifold on. Just know when you get ready to do this job, you're probably going to find there's a lot of buildup on these surfaces, and you're going to have to work at it pretty hard with the wire wheel, with a brush, maybe with a gasket scraper. Get them as smooth as possible. This connection right here faces the back of the motor for the crossover pipe, so you can't mix it up. Gonna get the nut started. I'm gonna get the rest started, and I'm gonna get the other exhaust manifold started, and then we're gonna torque them to spec. The torque value for the exhaust manifold connection to the heads is 30 foot-pounds. I'm gonna take them up gradually in a crossing pattern. That hit, and that hit. Okay, they're all torqued at 30 foot-pounds. We're going to do the same to the other side. The next thing we're going to put on are the heat shields for both exhaust manifolds. They're a little bit different in shape, so you can't mix them up. This one goes on with 3 10mm nuts, and the other one on the other side goes on with 1 10mm bolt and 2 10mm nuts. The torque value is 71 inch-pounds. We're not going to worry about breaking out a torque wrench for this. I'm just going to use my little short 3/8 ratchet and cinch them up good. Now we're going to get the crossover pipe connected to the exhaust manifolds. Yoda One provides exhaust gaskets for this connection and for the connection to the tailpipe. So you just slip it over the flange like so, and this is an actual crush type of gasket. So as you bring the two pieces together, they crush and make a seal. One thing that's noteworthy, if you paid attention when we took these things apart, is the studs came out with the nut. You have a choice. You can either just get some new studs, or you can put the studs into a vise, aluminum jaws I suggest, so that you don't mangle the threads, and you can work the nut off. So it's a decision of you want to spend some extra money, or you want to spend some extra time getting the nuts free of the studs and get the studs back into the exhaust manifold. I'm going to slide this over the studs. There we go. And then you get your 14mm nuts on. I got all the nuts touched down pretty snug. Now I'm going to transition to my torque wrench and torque them to 33 foot-pounds. That hit. That hit. I'll do the other side. And that hit. Next, we're going to install the oil filter union into the block. You tighten it with a 12mm Allen socket. The torque spec for the oil filter union is 18 foot-pounds. There it is, 18 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install the oil cooler union. It goes in right here. Ray decided to get a new one. You could reuse your old one. Use a 19mm deep socket. The torque value for this is 18 foot-pounds. Okay, that's cinching up. Okay, 18 foot-pounds. Now we're going to get the oil cooler onto the driver's side of the motor. Yoda One provides a gasket for it. You're going to have to pick out the old one. We found that it was pretty stuck in there. We had to work at it for a while, clean it up with a brass brush. We're going to get the new one in. Okay, I got the new gasket in. And see these tines right here? These tines go right over this part of the block. So you can't get it on wrong, because you might be thinking, oh, I don't want to get the fittings in the wrong position, but it really can only go on one way. Get your oil cooler bolt with a provided washer. Put the washer on and get this sucker on. This bolt is a 24mm The torque spec is 43 foot-pounds. There it is, 43 foot-pounds. We're now going to get some new oil cooler hoses attached. I'm going to get the smaller oil cooler hose on first. The side with the pink mark, you want to go to the union that goes into the block. And then just use a pair of bent nose, needle nose pliers and get the constant tension clamps in place. Next, we're going to get the bigger oil cooler hose. The side with the yellow mark goes to the fitting on the water pump. And then just get your constant tension clamps in place. When you're getting these clamps in place, think about the future if you ever wanted to replace the hose and get the ends of the constant tension clamp in a position where you feel it would be easiest to get to. We're now replacing the motor mounts because Ray got them as part of this job, and it is the opportune time to replace them. What we noticed is there's several part numbers for these motor mounts, and they're all compatible with the 3rd generation Toyota 4Runner. When I made the video of replacing the motor mounts and the transmission mount on my 2000 4Runner, the part number we had was 12361 62160, and then Ray got 2 different ones. Supposedly they all are compatible, a 62110 and a 62090. Kind of weird that all these part numbers are compatible for the engine mounts on these 3.4 liter V6 engines, but it seems to work. Maybe some of the part numbers got superseded and that's why, who knows. So we have the engine mount captured in my vise. This is the bracket that attaches the motor mount to the block of the engine. The center bolt right here is a 17 millimeter. So when this is on the engine, this is a lot harder to get to, but you can actually get to it. But we're going to take advantage of it being off the engine and do it right here at the bench vise. And there's your motor mount. And then we're just going to slip the other one in like that. We're debating on whether we should cinch it up really tight because maybe we want a little wiggle room. Because even with this pin, you can move it a little bit. We're choosing to go ahead and cinching them up. And then if we have to make an adjustment, from experience, I know I can get in here with this nice flex head gear wrench ratchet. It has 120 click points. I can get in there and loosen it because I've done it before. Ends up, it wasn't a good idea to get this oil cooler hose in place first because then it obstructs getting the motor mount bracket in place. So we have to pull it off. This side has the motor mount with the 3 connection points. We're going to get it up here and get the bolt started. As you can see right here, you can see how the oil cooler hose would get in the way. The torque spec for these motor mount bracket bolts to the block is 32 foot-pounds. There it is. There it is. There it is. Okay, they're all torqued to 32 foot-pounds. Now that the motor mount bracket is in place, we're going to get this smaller oil cooler hose in place. While we're on this side, we're going to get our oil filter on. This is the taller one you can get, a little bit more capacity. I'm just going to dab my finger in some motor oil, lubricate the gasket, and spin it on. How tight I get these is hand tight. I never get a wrench on it. If you're a big, strong guy like Lou Ferrigno or Arnold Schwarzenegger back in their heyday, maybe hand tight is too tight. But for me, that's good enough. No tool necessary. Next, we're going to get the oil pressure sensor in place. The factory service manual says to put some blue 242 Loctite on it. You could also use 243. Put some on the thread. Oh my God, I just shot my load. That's a lot. Okay. The torque value for this is 11 foot-pounds. you need a deep 26mm socket. We've heard that there are some different sizes to these, so you might even find yours is not a 26, it's a different size, so just know that. All I have available to me is a big box end wrench, so I'm just going to choke up on the wrench and snug it up. And that feels like 11 foot-pounds to my torque elbow. Next, we're going to get the crank position sensor in. It goes in right here. And the way this works is this thing is magnetized. And it takes a reading off the teeth of the timing gear right here. A mistake that some people have made is in the process of pulling this off for a timing belt job, they break these little teeth off and they think, no big deal, there's a whole bunch of teeth left. Well, it is a big deal because then it's going to throw off the crank position sensor, and people learn this the hard way, and then they got to tear the front end of their engine apart to replace this timing gear that they messed up. So slide it in there, get your little 10mm bolt started. The torque spec for this is 69 inch-pounds. There it is, 69 inch-pounds. Next, we're going to get the water neck studs in place. They go right in here. The thermostat goes right here. Ray went ahead and bought some new ones. If you didn't do that, you could harvest the old ones off of the old water pump. You'd have to use the double nut technique to draw them out. I'm going to use the double nut technique to tighten them up into the water pump. So I'm going to start them by hand. It has a long thread side and a short thread side. The short thread side goes into the water pump. Is it absolutely necessary to double nut these to get them super tight? I don't know if it is, but we're going to do it anyways. Double nut or these nuts.
Got it!
We're going to install the thermostat and the lower water neck. If you're reusing your thermostat, I highly suggest you get a new gasket. If you're reusing this water neck, this is a brand new one that Ray got for the job. A lot of times you're going to see some corrosion on here. I would suggest cleaning this up really good to get a good mating with the new gasket. This gasket has a slit in the middle. You just fit it around right here. Now here's something that people go back and forth. Are you sure the jiggle valve goes in the 6 o'clock position, not the 12 o'clock, because air rises? Yes, we are absolutely sure the jiggle valve points down towards the ground in the 6 o'clock position. This makes a difference of at least 10 degrees, so you'll run 10 degrees cooler if you have the jiggle valve in the 6 o'clock position rather than the 12 o'clock position. Trust me. So put that on, 6 o'clock jiggle valve, get your water neck on. And then get your 12mm nuts on. The torque spec for these three 12mm nuts is 14 foot-pounds. 14, there it is. They're all torqued to 14 foot-pounds. The next thing we're going to get on the engine is the cam position sensor. You want the wire to route right behind this little metal bracket behind the timing belt to protect the wire from being damaged by the timing belt. It can only go in one way. It's got this little stud that goes into this hole, and then this is the hole for the bolt. The little clip that holds this wire in place behind this bracket was broken on Ray's engine. So what I did is just put a little zip tie here to hold it in place so it can't move. The torque value for that 10mm bolt is 69 inch-pounds. There it is. The connector's right here. I'm just going to go ahead and connect it. We're going to put the upper timing cover on. It's held on by 6 10mm bolts. There are these funky ones like this. Ray only has 4 of the 6. The last guy who worked on it was lazy and didn't get the lower 2 because they're harder to get to. What we're going to do for Ray is we're just going to put 2 here and the 2 on the bottom, which are harder to get to once the motor is in the engine compartment, So we're just going to leave these two open. The torque spec for these upper timing cover bolts is 80 inch-pounds. One thing we forgot to mention is the Yoda 1 kit comes with new gasket material. It's like a little foam gasket, and what this does is help seal the timing belt area and the pulleys from contaminants. If your gasket is still in good shape, it's up to you whether you replace it. Just know that this gasket does come with the kit. The cam position sensor plugs in right here. Hopefully your clip will still be there. I'm going to slide the timing belt guide over the crankshaft. You want the cupped outside or slightly concave side facing the harmonic balancer, facing out. You just slide it and align it to the Woodruff key. I'm next going to get the lower timing cover in place. These are also 10 millimeter. They're the same type of bolt as the upper cover. Same torque value as the upper cover, 80 inch-pounds. Okay, they're all torqued to spec. The next thing we're going to get in position is the starter wire bracket. It goes right here and it fixes with a couple 10 millimeter bolts. We're going to torque these to 80 inch-pounds. We didn't have the torque value for it, but since it's the same size bolt as these, 80 inch-pounds sounds good to me. Okay, that's torque to spec. Next, we're going to hook up this ground wire to the block right here. It's a 14 millimeter bolt. Don't have a torque value for this, but we're going to use that spec we all know and love, good and tight. Okay, that's good and tight. We got a little out of order. We shouldn't have got the upper timing cover in place before we got the fan bracket in place. So we had to take the timing cover out of the way because the fan bracket needs to go behind it. The cover actually goes right along this top edge. If you remember, these studs came out of the block when we took off the fan bracket. So we're going to screw them back in. The stud has two sides. The shorter thread side goes into the block. We're going to use the double nut technique to cinch these up too. We're not going to show it because we've already showed it in other spots. We got the studs secure into the block. We're going to slide our fan bracket in place. The bolt goes in the top connection. On this side, before you get the nut in place, you want to put this adjuster for the power steering pump. This hook goes into the hole right there. Get this nut in place. We searched high and low in the factory service manual for a torque value for this, and then I remembered when we did the timing belt job, I also couldn't find a torque value for these 3 fasteners that hold the fan bracket to the engine. So I'm just gonna again use that German spec of good and tight.
Okay, Herr Good and Tight.
And that's good and tight. Now we're gonna get the cover back on. As you can see, it fits over the fan bracket. We're gonna get the alternator bracket connected up to the head. It's held on by 3 12 millimeter bolts. It goes right here. We're going to torque these to 14 foot-pounds. That hit, and that hit. 14 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to put on this generator insulator bracket, or your alternator insulator bracket. It goes on right here with a couple 10 millimeter bolts. We don't have a torque value for this. I'm just going to snug them up with my shorty ratchet. And that's good. Next, we're going to get this alternator bracket connected. This is where the adjuster, so you can tighten the belt, connects to. And it goes right here underneath the water neck. 14 millimeter bolt. Next, we're going to get the alternator in place.
Okay.
The alternator slides in right here. You're going to find this is going to be a little tight. You just got to wiggle it and you'll get it in. Brand new alternator. This guy Ray knows how to build an engine. It's looking barely lined up. Get your pivot bolt. See if you can get it in. Not yet. I think I got it started. Okay. Now we're going to get the adjuster in place. You have to swing the alternator down to meet up with this bracket. You have to slide the stud through the bracket first, then through the alternator, and then the bolt goes right here. And then we'll just put this on. All this stuff we're going to leave loose for now. The pivot bolt, this nut that locks in the adjuster, and then we're wondering if we should tighten this one now or just wait till we get the alternator belt tight and then tighten this one. Yeah, we're going to wait to tighten this one too until we get the belt tight. We're just going to cinch this up sort of snug to where we can still manipulate this. Next, we're going to get the oil dipstick tube connected. There's a rubber O-ring on the bottom that seats it into the oil pump. I'm going to lubricate the O-ring with a little motor oil, and then you slide it behind the water neck, and then you plug it in. And then you affix it to this alternator bracket with a 10mm bolt. We're going to torque the oil dipstick bolt to 71 inch-pounds. And then we're gonna install our oil dipstick. We're gonna get the power steering pump bracket connected. It's held on by 3 14mm bolts. The torque value for these 3 bolts is 32 foot-pounds. We shouldn't have got this heat deflector over the exhaust manifold before getting the engine mount bracket in place because it gets in the way. No big deal. 3 10mm nuts and it's out of our way. We get the couple bolts started right here. They're a 14mm. You want to leave this bottom right corner open because the AC bracket goes over, and you put a bolt through the AC compressor bracket, then through the engine mount bracket, and then into the block. We're going to torque these 3 engine mount bracket bolts to 32 foot-pounds. There it goes. There it goes. There it goes. Now we're going to get the AC bracket in place. It's held on with a long bolt coming in from the front, and then 3 fasteners here. I'm going to get the long bolt in first. This one is a shorter one. I'm going to put it here. And then the 2 longer bolts go up here. The torque value for the bolts is 35 foot-pounds. There it is, there it is, there it is, and there it is. There's one more bolt that we have to get in place, and it captures this bracket that's supposed to hold the wire loom, but the little clip is broken that holds the wire loom, and then this folds around the transmission cooler lines that run to the radiator. Same torque value, 35 foot-pounds. There it is. We have another bracket that holds the transmission cooler lines to the passenger side of the block, and it goes in the last hole towards the rear. Don't know the torque value of this one. I'm just going to snug it up firm. All it is holding the cooler line, so I'm not too worried about it. And that's good. When you get around to putting the oil dipstick tube in place, get your wiring harness in this position. It routes right in front of the oil dipstick tube. It goes behind the water neck, and then it comes down and it clips into the crank position sensor. We had to use a zip tie. The clip broke and we don't want the sensor to disconnect. And then the other wire that's part of this harness loops around behind the water neck and goes to the oil pressure sensor. And then also this bracket needs to go onto the stud for the water neck. So you want to get this wiring bracket on there first before you put this nut on. And the nut is torqued to 14 foot-pounds. We're going to get this ground wire attached to the back of the passenger side head. It goes into this last hole right here. And that's good. The next thing we want to do is get the rear end plate and the flex plate on the back of the motor. To do that, we first have to get it off the engine stand. So we're supporting the weight of the engine right now with the cherry picker, and then we're going to unbolt it from the stand. In order to tighten the flex plate bolts to spec, we want to get the harmonic balancer onto the end of the crankshaft with the crank pulley bolt. This normally would be the opportune time to torque this to spec, but we're waiting on a crank pulley bolt from Toyota, which is going to come this afternoon. So we're just going to put this on so we can hold the crankshaft steady while we torque the flex plate bolts on the backside, which are also connected to the crankshaft. When you're getting this crank pulley on, you want to align the notch with the Woodruff key on the crankshaft. Before we put the flex plate on, we want to get the rear end plate in position. You can't mess this up because it goes through the alignment dowels, and this is where the starter comes through. So you get it over the alignment dowels, and then it's held in with just one 10mm bolt right here. The torque spec for that bolt is 63 inch-pounds. And that's it, 63 inch-pounds. Now we're going to get the flex plate in position. The flex plate comes with a front and rear spacer. The spacer that mates up with the end of the crankshaft has a little nub, a little nipple here, and it goes into this hole right here. So you really can't mess this up. You put that on first, and then the flex plate's going to go on next, and then the orientation for this spacer that faces the back, it has a little bit of a concave side, and that's facing the back. There's a lip here. I'm just going to use the one bolt as a placeholder for now, and I'm going to line one up and get it started. And I'm going to go ahead and get another one started so it doesn't rotate on me. Please. Okay. The factory service manual says to use some Loctite for these flex plate bolts. It specifies blue 243, but all we can find is 242, and that's going to be good enough. The 243 is just the new spec for the 242. What I did here with these placeholder bolts is I put a white mark on them to let me know that those are the two that don't have any Loctite on them yet. So shake up your Loctite really good, and then get a little bit on the end of the threads, and then screw it in place. And you get the idea. I'm going to do the same with the rest. Now we're going to torque the flex plate bolts to spec. The spec is 66 foot-pounds. What Ray is going to do is he's going to hold the front of the crankshaft steady, because as I tighten these, it's going to want to turn the motor, and it's going to want to turn it this way. So he's going to be on the front holding counter pressure to where it won't turn the crankshaft. We're going to use a crossing pattern and slowly bring them up to the spec. I decided to add some numbers so it's easier for me to keep track. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm going to keep on doing passes like that. That clicked 1. That clicked 2. That clicked 3. That clicked 4. That clicked 5. That clicked 6. That clicked 7. That clicked 8. Okay, they're all torqued to 66 foot-pounds.